February 18, 2026. We are in the fourth year, and this is day 360 since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Welcome, I greet you, for the situation report. In today's report, we see some territorial shifts on both sides. We see incredibly funny statements from the Russian Ministry of Defense. I found something for you there. What is really absolutely grotesque and funny at the same time, and what we also see, of course, are complaints from Russian Z-bloggers. Of course, we also see the situation in the country on both sides, and we also see ourselves. A railway, funny liberation actions, some special forces, and much more. Stay tuned, definitely subscribe if you haven't already, and support the channel for free. You could already hear it in the intro. We are approaching the end of the fourth year of the war, and even though this war has been dragging on for a long time, there is always something new to report. And as always, the best part is a brief summary in the situation report. Take a look here. Well, were you able to spot it already? Maybe we should take another look. Perhaps you'll see it now. An advisor to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense reports on a new Russian tactic, Shahed drones. We've now seen them in various versions. The Russians have attached all sorts of things to them, such as anti-aircraft missiles, to fend off helicopters that want to shoot down these Shahed drones. We've seen several explosive charges, and we've also seen mines attached to them, which they use to cause further harm to soldiers or bomb disposal teams on the ground. If you want to remove this drone or its debris, and now there's something new because Shahed drones are not only supposed to be used as kamikaze weapons, but also to transport first-person view drones. According to him, there are now the first video confirmations of this, like this one here. According to this, a single Shahed apparently carries 2 kamikaze drones under its fuselage, meaning first-person view drones, the smaller ones. These could be released during the approach to then independently attack targets. The advisor explicitly warns Ukrainian units to take this new threat seriously and to adjust their protective measures accordingly. If this method is confirmed and on a large scale, it would be a logical development. The Shahed has a long range and can penetrate deep into Ukrainian territory. If it can also operate with FPVS, a new layered attack chain will emerge. First the long-range carrier, then several flexible short-range attacks nearby, which can target vehicles, civilians, or air defense positions, for example. Militarily, this naturally also increases the complexity of defense. Even if the Shahed is shot down, the drones it carries could possibly continue to operate, or at least create additional dangers. If it is not detected in time, not only a single strike is threatened, but a combination of several attacks, each one more precise than the last. So while Russian soldiers are further developing the Shahed, Maria Zakharova is busy in Chinese with the so-called New Year's wishes for the Chinese New Year. It's certainly advantageous to already be able to speak the language of future overlords. I definitely agree with that. There's nothing to argue against it. But yesterday, I read the book The Art of War again. I actually read it at least once every year because I think it's essential, especially if you have a military background yourself. And you should really reflect on the many pieces of wisdom and ideas in it, because even after so many hundreds of years, you can still use them in a modern war like this one. And in exactly this context, I noticed something again. I'm going to quote now from the German edition by Territorial Verlag, and then you can get an idea of the war in Ukraine while listening and maybe make a comparison. Quote, "In fact, there has never been a country that gained an advantage from a long war. You have to know the confusion and disadvantages that a war brings in its wake to understand that you cannot gain any benefit from it." Furthermore, he says that if the war lasts a long time, the country often runs out of money to continue it. If the will to fight has weakened, the weapons are worn out, and funds for waging war can no longer be obtained. Then the neighboring states often notice this desperate situation and attack the unfortunate state. Think of China, think of the false friendship, and then always remember these words in the rest of the report. And where there are no words of mercy is to the northeast of Pokrov. The Russians have now completely captured Monograd, which was also reported by the Ukrainian side, as well as the eastern shore of Chervony Liman. They now only have the problem that the Ukrainians are more or less standing out in the open here. There are still some fortifications up here, also in the direction of Vorodinska, as well as here at Attrition. However, they now have to fall back to these positions. That, of course, makes it harder for Ukraine to hold the area. They hardly have anything left here within Pokrovs or Menograd where they can defend themselves against the Russians, and they are forced to fall back to other positions. Doesn't that make it easier for the Russians to pin down the Ukrainians, more or less? Or to come under direct fire, for example, from artillery or even from drones? Because the Russians clearly have many more opportunities to hide in the urban areas around Pokrovs, or to dig in than the Ukrainians here, a bit further north of the city. But I don't think things will look really good for the Russians here in the next few days, and that they'll make huge gains here. I think this is still a very, very tough area where you can keep running into a brick wall. Ukrainian sources report their forces have reclaimed about 130 square kilometers in Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk over the last 3 weeks. And this concerns the area a bit further to the west, specifically here, where I previously mentioned the latest attacks. As I said, there have been several attacks here. And the Ukrainians are reporting significant territorial gains here, which I haven't marked on the map yet, since from my perspective, they are not entirely clear yet. They say they're taking full advantage of Russia's communication issues caused by Starlink. At the same time, however, as mentioned, Russian troops have also managed to make small territorial gains in the Pokrovsk area, which we just saw, and have increased their activities at the border of the Sumy region. So there are territorial gains on both sides. Although Ukrainians are attacking here for the first time in a while, we shouldn't get too excited yet. We're not talking about 130 square kilometers in just a few days here, but rather about 130 square kilometers over 3 weeks. And these gains are offset by smaller Ukrainian losses on other sections of the front. This is not an operational breakthrough, but rather a gradual shift of the line. As I said, the Ukrainians are recapturing some land here, while the Russians, for example, near Pokrovsk, have managed to retake part of it themselves. The pattern remains typical for a war of attrition. Space is gained locally, but lost elsewhere. What's crucial is less about the absolute area and more about who controls the operational tempo and who has structural problems. And this is where it gets interesting, of course. Russian forces are currently struggling with communication disruptions caused by Starlink whitelisting. Worse improvised radio solutions and attacks on antennas and relay points don't help. Modern warfare depends entirely on stable communication, and that's the most important thing every commander needs to know. Without reliable connections, coordination breaks down, making drones less precise, artillery slower to respond, and putting the officer's situation at risk. If Russia doesn't get these problems under control, it could actually mean several Ukrainian territorial gains in the end, which the Russians won't be able to take back with the same effort. In a war like this, it's often not spectacular offensives that decide the outcome, but rather seemingly inconspicuous factors in the background: supply, leadership, communication. It's not just about brute firepower. What good is a large army if I can't feed it? What use are the best supplies or weapons if ammo doesn't reach the front, or the best soldiers if they operate without communication? Whoever hesitates first loses momentum and then initiative, which is the lesson here. As Ukrainians report gains, Russians are already complaining about their own people, leaving the soldiers in the lurch even though they're fighting for them at the front, almost like a stab-in-the-back moment. A prominent Russian Z-blogger named Goldman, whom we've seen several times in these situation reports, is striking an unusually candid tone. In a video message, he warns that everything could completely collapse by the end of the year. His main complaint: fewer and fewer people in Russia are willing to support the participants of the so-called special operation financially or materially. He describes a noticeable donation fatigue. It's not luxury goods that are lacking, but the basics. Some units can no longer even afford enough socks and underwear, while at the same time generators, vehicles, and technical equipment are urgently needed. His words are raw, frustrated, almost a bit desperate. He says that the guys are tired and that the country itself is very exhausted. What stands out most is his observation about the mood in society. Above all, educated or economically better off circles are increasingly questioning the purpose of this war. What is it actually good for? The willingness to donate voluntarily is therefore clearly decreasing here, especially among this group of people. He recalls that at the beginning of the war, many Moscow companies provided diesel vehicles or equipment. Today, many of these businesses have closed themselves. He says that hundreds of restaurants in Moscow alone have given up. The economic burden is therefore clearly noticeable, and as a result, the private support base for the troops is also shrinking. Such statements are therefore very remarkable because they do not come from opposition circles, but from the pro-war environment. He is pro-Russian, or rather, was very loyal to the Kremlin in recent years. If even there people openly talk about outrage, economic pressure, exhaustion, and lack of support, then that indicates a change in mood. It must be so bad by now that he speaks about it publicly, even though everyone knows that this can have serious consequences in Russia. From a military perspective, of course, this is not decisive for the war, but in the long run, morale on the home front can become just as important as the situation at the front. A war that drags on for years needs not only soldiers, but also support from society. And when that erodes, the pressure begins not only at the front, but also within the country. And the Kremlin is more afraid of that than of a defeat at the front. And I promise you that. But of course, everything is going according to plan, at least if you believe the Russian Deputy Defense Minister. He says that, I'm sorry, I have to laugh at that. He claims that the shutdown of Starlink had no impact whatsoever on the communication or operations of the Russian army. Starlink was basically never really there in any meaningful way, so it was totally unnecessary and stupid anyway. What's more, it only served to mislead the Ukrainian forces. You have to let that sink in for a moment. For months, it was known that Russian units along the front were intensively using Starlink terminals. Threat controls, coordination and situational awareness, numerous reports, videos, and even Russian military bloggers confirm the absolute dependence on this system. Now, all of that is supposed to have just been an elaborate deception. They never really needed them anyway. They just wanted Ukraine to believe that the entire Russian army was made unavoidably dependent on Starlink. I think you see the problem even if a system had no operational significance at all. So why was there such an intense effort to keep it running? Why the improvised workarounds? Why the sudden switch to primitive Wi-Fi bridges and directional antennas? The statement seems less like strategic sovereignty and more like damage control. In modern combat, a stable data connection is not a luxury, but a prerequisite for effectiveness. Whoever loses communication loses speed, and whoever loses speed loses the initiative. But officially, on Russia's side, everything remains under control. No panic, there's no graphite here, and of course there are no serious consequences. And if there were, then of course it was just part of a brilliant plan that the ordinary citizen simply can't understand. Because that's what's being claimed here. I mean, please, just take a look at this masterpiece. How he just reads the text off the teleprompter and asks himself the question, and look at his face. Who is supposed to believe that? He knows himself that the situation is pretty bad. When it comes to communication, the Russian army has completely relied on a system they've become dependent on and which they can't really control without having a good alternative. Russia obviously has satellites and other alternatives, so there's no need to discuss it. But none of these alternatives, not even their satellites, can match the speed or the effectiveness of Starlink, especially not on such a wide scale. That's just the way it is. There really isn't a good alternative. The next best alternative to Starlink is a similar system, but it's owned by the Europeans. And that's exactly the point. No alternative system is actually mentioned in this video. They just say there are some, they talk about alternatives. But, you know, the Russians, but even if they had a nationwide system that was better or equal to Starlink, then I wonder why they were dependent on Starlink for so long and even attached the terminals to drones. And if there had been a good replacement, they would have been bragging about it, like with the Attrition, like with the Kinjal, like with every other Russian wonder weapon. Innovation or idea that they had, and I mean honestly, the Ministry of Defense has even claimed that donkeys would be a good alternative to vehicles at the front, and they have strongly defended this suggestion. And here, there isn't a single word about the supposedly good other alternatives, which of course have been hidden and kept secret. And pretending to the Ukrainians that they were dependent on Starlink was very strange. And which company was able to manufacture them in large quantities in such a short time and make them available? I think this company comes from Dinkin. At least you could use the Starlink device terminals to scrape ice off your windshield, so they weren't totally useless. The Special Forces of Omega, a unit of the Ukrainian National Guard, have reportedly carried out a rather risky operation in the Pokrovsk area, and in the process they freed one of their own soldiers who had reportedly been in captivity for 27 days. According to the unit's commander, the officer with the call sign Karad was extracted from an area almost deep in enemy territory. He is now on his way to Kiev, where he will receive medical care again. There were no details about the exact process or the rescue. Those were not released. However, they did post a picture with him after the rescue operation. Special Security Service of Ukraine units and the 14th Brigade of the National Guard's 1st Corps, also known as Azov, supported the operation. The coordinated cooperation of several units indicated that this was a complex, carefully prepared operation. Such rescue missions are militarily risky and extremely significant politically. They tie up resources, require precise reconnaissance, and carry a high potential for escalation. After all, you could lose many good soldiers in the attempt to save just one. So he was either extremely capable and worth rescuing, or he possesses information that absolutely must not fall into Russian hands. Such actions also send a strong internal signal. The leadership shows they're willing to bring back their soldiers even in tough situations, though we shouldn't kid ourselves about that. If it had been a simple enlisted man or a non-commissioned officer, he certainly wouldn't have been rescued. Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew, especially Colonel Draneka, Scylla, Dietrich, Freddie, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next Situation Report.